Hello, good afternoon, or almost afternoon, and welcome to the Drasha for Beis Abraham Congregation for Parshat Chaye Sarah 2020, 5771. And I want to begin with an announcement, just in case you haven't seen the email that's gone out, that in light of the newly issued county safe at home and elevated levels of COVID-19 incidents in our area, services in person at Beis Abe this Shabbos are canceled, and we will continue to send out updates to the email list about when we might be reopening. But I also want to encourage you, seeing this, that there's other ways to get connected to Beis Abe, not streaming on YouTube, but this Saturday night at 7 p.m. and Sunday night also at 7 is our annual Science and Judaism Weekend of Learning. And Sunday morning, there will be a program for kids connected with that, science activities for kids. We have great guest speakers, Rabbi Dan Margulies and Professor Jeremy Bueller, who will be speaking on several different topics at the intersection of science and Torah. So it should be a really great experience, and the information on how to register for that and get the Zoom links is on the Beis Abe website, BaisAbe, BAISABE.com. All right. I want to speak about Avraham Avinu. Abraham is credited with many important spiritual innovations and accomplishments, from rediscovering monotheism in an era of idolatry to perfecting the art of hospitality together with his wife Sarah and their household. And there are too many other accomplishments besides these to name them all here this morning. Could be here until Shabbos comes in. But of all Abraham's spiritual innovations, I think the most underrated is the invention of mourning. That's mourning, M-O-U-R-N, not M-O-R-N. After the death of Sarah, the Torah relates, Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'livkosa. Avraham came to lament for Sarah and to weep for her. And before that moment, the Torah had not described any form of mourning in all the someone. This is the first appearance of the verb lispod, which means to lament or bewail. And although the other verb in that verse, livkos, to weep, has appeared in the context of Hagar weeping for her son whom she thinks is about to die, this is the first time that this word has been employed to describe mourning someone after their death. Now, we might think people must have been mourning their departed loved ones from the beginning without it being recorded in the Torah, but I'm not so sure. Grief is a feeling, an emotional state, but mourning is an act. It's a process. As Joan Didion put it in her masterful memoir of grief, The Year of Magical Thinking, grief was passive. Grief happened. Mourning, the act of dealing with grief, required attention. So taking Didion's distinction between grief and mourning, while grief is natural, something and presumably grief had been going on and it had been an experience people had been having since the very first death, since Cain murdered his brother Hevel. Presumably, Adam and Chava, and perhaps even Cain himself, felt grief after that event. But mourning was a technology that had to be invented, no less so than the plow or making musical instruments or weapons. And all of those major technological innovations were recorded in the Torah. And it makes sense then that the Torah would have recorded the invention of such an important and basic human experience as mourning. And I think that record is here in our Parsha, in Chaye Sarah. And that it's only with the death of Sarah that we witness that invention of mourning. He took someone with Abraham's vision, his faith, and his courage to teach the world description of mourning, and not, as I would have it, the description of the first mourning. But either way, it bears close examination as a prototype for how to mourn. The two verbs that of mourning that our verse speaks of describe, I suggest, two stages in the mourning process, or two facets of the mourning process. Lispod, which means to wail or lament, is often translated in English as eulogize. But this is a very imperfect translation. Similarity between a eulogy and a hesped ends there. The word eulogy comes from a Greek root meaning praise. And a eulogy is exactly that, words of praise for the deceased. By contrast, a hesped is something much more raw and emotional. Our sages of blessed memory defined a hesped as dvarim hameshabarim es halev, words which shatter the heart. A hesped is supposed to be heartbreaking. Now, a hesped might involve praise for the dead, but the praise is ultimately in service of the primary purpose, which is to bring its audience to tears. Often when I'm speaking with someone who's just lost a loved one, and we're talking about who's going to speak at the funeral, very often there's someone in the family who will say, I can't speak because I'll cry. And I always think, who gave you the idea that there's a problem with crying at a funeral? And I think a lot of us walk around with that belief that there's something wrong with crying at a funeral. And if not at a funeral, then anywhere else, certainly. But the whole point of a hesped is to get people to cry, including the speaker themselves, I would suggest. And that's actually why we don't deliver hespedim during festive seasons of the year, during the month of Nisan in the spring when Passover takes place, and during the month of Tishrei when we have Sukkot and other festive holidays. Because public flaunting of grief, to say nothing of the idea of deliberately provoking sadness in others, I think something that people often misunderstand, because we say, when we translate hesped as eulogy, and we say we don't give eulogies during festive seasons, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Why on earth not? But the truth is, we do deliver eulogies. We deliver words of praise for the deceased all year long. What we don't do is deliver a hesped deliberately trying to make people weep during the festive seasons of the year. Now, I think it's no accident that as American Jews, we've gotten our hespeds and our eulogies mixed up. Because I think we are actually much more comfortable with the idea of a eulogy than a hesped. As Americans, we tend to regard grief and sadness as somehow pathological, rather than as the natural parts of life that they are. And we treat happiness as the only acceptable state of mind. In her book, Didion points out that we are so afraid or averse to grief and mourning that more and more we don't even choose to hold funerals or even memorial services for departed loved ones. Instead, we will have a gathering that we'll call a celebration of life. And like them, we would do well to learn from Abraham's example of how to give full expression to our grief. Now, Abraham didn't just lament Sarah. According to the verse, he also wept for her. And at first glance, this would seem to be redundant. So I know he lamented for her. Why do you need to also tell me that he wept for her? But I think we can find a clue about the distinction between lamenting and weeping in the Gemara, in the Talmud. The Talmud engages in a lengthy debate about the purpose of hesped, of lamenting the dead. It asks the question, is lamenting the dead for the honor of the dead or the honor of the living? Is the purpose of the funeral and the mourning rituals that go with it to give honor to the departed soul? Or is it primarily for the benefit of those who are left behind? Is it for their emotional needs? In the end, the Gemara actually concludes, after a lengthy debate, that hesped is for the honor of the dead, not for the honor of the living. This idea that hesped is mourning is for the honor of the dead, means that those of us who'd prefer to go the route of a celebration of life, not have a traditional funeral, not have a memorial service, are actually doing a disservice not only to ourselves and our own need to process our grief, but also to the deceased by denying them the honor of being properly mourned. No amount of praise at a celebration of life can match the honor of being simply and honestly mourned. Now, it's only after Abraham mourns Sarah as this means of honoring her through by being lispod, lamenting her. After that, he weeps for her. And I want to suggest that the weeping is distinct from the lamenting in that this is not lamenting her as a means of honoring her, but this is Abraham's simple expression of his own grief. And it's only after he does that, first lamenting Sarah and then weeping for her, that we read that Abraham gets up and buys a plot of land in which to bury Sarah. Now, on the surface, this might just seem like a natural continuation of the process of honoring her through lamenting her, but I think it's something different. After all, generally speaking, the custom is to attend to the needs of burial first and only then begin the process of mourning. Shiva, the 7-day mourning period that we traditionally observe, doesn't begin until after the funeral is over. So why do the descriptions of the preparations for Sarah's funeral come after telling us that Abraham lamented her and mourned her and wept for her? Buying a burial plot. He was acquiring the first piece of land for him and his descendants in what would become their homeland, in the land that God promised to them. And by buying this piece of land to bury Sarah in, He wasn't just showing her honor by giving her a proper burial. He was furthering the mission that they had both been partners in, of building a home for their family in what would become the land of Israel. Sarah had been Abraham's companion and partner in all the years of journeying from their ancestral homeland to the land of Canaan. She was his partner in building up a community of believers, people who accepted the existence of one God, the creator of the universe. She was his partner in raising their son Yitzhak, and in the mitzvah of showing hospitality to guests, setting the example for their descendants for all time. And by buying a piece of land to bury her in, Abraham was making a concrete step to make sure that Sarah's life's work would live on after her. And that is indeed a fitting way to honor someone's memory, to do acts that further their life's work and their values in their memory after they're gone. Just because he needed, not just because he needed to do that for his own sake, but he did that because that's the proper order for honoring someone. You first honor them for mourning, and then you honor them by furthering their values and their purpose. I think in the same way that we as Americans who are very reluctant to fully enter into grief and mourning, we try to bypass the funeral and have a celebration of life. In the same way, we try to bypass proper mourning and we jump straight to honoring someone's memory through praiseworthy acts in their name to get rushed, to get to work. We live in a time in which there is much mourning to be done. And yet many of those few social structures we had for mourning, we're not a culture that really likes to engage in mourning, but we have some social structures for that, especially within the observant Jewish community. But even those structures don't really work the way they used to. We don't have big funerals anymore. We don't have big gatherings in someone's home for Shiva, or at least we shouldn't right now during the pandemic. Right now, on a level, our community is grieving the loss last week of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, whose writings helped inspire and guide countless people, and who served as a model of modern orthodoxy as a project of engaging with the larger non-Jewish world, not as an act of compromise with our core Torah values, but as a fulfillment of those values, and as a way of deepening our understanding and our commitment to our own Torah. During this pandemic, many of us are grieving private losses of friends and relatives and acquaintances. And at the same time, we're deprived of, we need to give ourselves a chance to properly mourn. First of all, because we just need that psychologically. But second of all, we need to do that in order to properly honor them. And only when we've done that can we, like Avraham Avinu, find the strength necessary to do the noble and needed work that will carry on the